I'd like to welcome everyone to this panel discussion, which is about a number of research pieces that are discussing how you transform an industry and how you really deal with a country that's trying to evolve at a time where you need a multitude of different industries backing up your society. I'm so pleased to say that today with us is Alexei Alexishvili. He's chairman and CEO for Policy and Management Consulting Group. Previously, he was the Minister of Finance and Minister of Economic Development for Georgia, as well as the chair for the United Nations Commission of Sustainable Development. We also have Chris Papageorgiou, who is the advisor and mission chief for Bangladesh, Asia, and Pacific Department for the IMF, also the author of a number of different journals. And Dauda Samben, I would also like to welcome. He is founder and CEO of AfriCatalyst, which is a global advisory development advisory based in Senegal. He also has been part of the IMF, working about the African Union, as well as senior economic advisor to the president of Senegal and special advisor on food security. I want to start, Chris, because you've conducted so much research, really specifically talking about what it means to have economic diversification. What are we even talking about when you talk about that phrase?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Lisa. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and Alexi and Dauda to speak about this very important issue of diversification. So you're right, this is a very good question. So myself and a number of colleagues in the fund have been conducting this research going back now a decade. So when we started thinking about diversification, we had a very simple definition in mind, and that is how a country can broaden its production, usually in the export side, to more productive industries. So moving from traditional industries like agriculture and commodities to more productive industries. Now, of course, this is a very simple definition. Basically, it means that you go from one or two goods of exports to more than that. Now, of course, as we've done this work, we recognized at least two additional dimensions of diversification that are very, very important. So one, we found out that as countries develop, gets to a point where they abandon the number of goods they export and they focus more on going up the quality ladder. In other words, they focus on one or two or three goods, and then they advance their knowledge, they build their human capital to climb up that ladder. There are many examples. For example, India is one example we focus on in our recent study, where they focus on IT, they have the human capital, and then they evolve on that very high, steep quality of that particular good. So in addition to the horizontal side of diversification, the number of goods that you are exporting gets to a point in the development process of a country that starts going up the quality ladder. Instead of sending more goods out, you start specializing more and advancing on the quality dimension. And then there is a third dimension, which is usually not so much studied, which is diversification of the trading partners. In other words, who do you do business with? And I think in this world we live in today, which is more fragmented, this issue, this dimension of diversification is taking more prominence. Who is your network of trading partners? So when we think about countries diversifying, they can be doing one or all of these three. They can be involved in one or all three of these dimensions. And here I can give you a few examples, Lisa. When we think about Vietnam, they started from being a very agricultural productivity country, sending out goods, rice in particular, to a few trading partners, maybe a couple. And now where they are today is a fully functioning manufacturing production industry with a very, very sophisticated network of trading partners.
Yeah, that's fascinating, especially having just come from APEC down in Peru, where I was talking to the Malaysian trade minister, talking about something similar, as well as in the Philippines. Alexi, in some ways, Georgia is kind of a case study of how an economy can go from something that's very centralized and focused to something much more broader and market-based. Can you give us a sense of what the experience there has been and how it kind of got there?
Good morning and good afternoon for those who are listening from other places. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation. Let me start by Georgia's a little bit background and history about diversification, because diversification played crucial role for developing Georgia's economy after collapse of Soviet Union. We need to consider that after right dissolution of Soviet Union, Georgia entered into really very devastated situation by some civil unrest and political crisis and many different problems that we faced that time. And right after that, the most important problem was that how we could transform Georgia not only from centralized economy and just only just from one particular system to another, but we also wanted to reach the target when the overall economy will be functioning completely different with all elements of statehood, and that was covering, like, the whole reform was more horizontal diversification rather than just sectoral or so-called vertical diversification. We will probably talk about that during next 1 hour when we talk about diversification as an instrument for economic development. So for Georgia, just to also, like, talk about the economic reforms and the achievements that we have been achieved during this period of time, is that like having around 5.7% average growth rate during this period of time, and I'm talking about starting from 1996 to 2024 until now, then also considering that these diversification achievements also being reflected in both sides, all in GDP structure, and that was diversified quite heavily, because after dissolution of Soviet Union, when we have only state-owned enterprise manufacturing and semi-developed agriculture and household production, which was the biggest part of our GDP. And recently, when we see that some new sectors have been emerged in terms of transport and logistics, and we see like tourism development, and we see many different service-oriented GDP sectors, and that's been diversified quite heavily as well. And on the other side, we see diversification on both sides. This is export and import, because you could understand that, like previously, that was more centralized economy integrated into Soviet Union with their republics, and recently we are heavily diversified with many our partner countries all over the world, but mainly this is European Union, and the target further integration to European Union is also definitely an agenda of the country, and with other partners in the world. And also another point is this diversification with FDIs, like foreign direct investments, and that's also very important to see that this increase or active attraction of foreign direct investments in the countries also obvious, and we see that this is also reflected in the indicators of our economy. But also, let me also underline one particular point, that diversification and further so-called horizontal diversification and flexibility in the economy helped us not only target the economic growth, but also fast and smooth recovery from the external shocks that we have faced during this period of time. And that was really very important. For example, after 2008 military conflict with Russia, and that was also very obvious after global financial crisis. That was also obvious during pandemics, and even recently we see like very active dynamics in the economy, and that's also very important. That this flexibility gives the opportunity to be adjusted to new realities, which is really very important element for the economy.
What's fascinating to me is inherent in the discussion that you and Chris just had was this idea that the contours of how to expand out the horizontal kind of diversification of economies can really be different depending on which country you're talking about and the circumstances of it. Dauda, I'd love from your experiences with Africa Catalyst, what you've experienced in terms of how different economies in Africa are trying to diversify and what the goal is in terms of trying to improve just the broader well-being of different populations?
Yes, well, thank you, thank you very much, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here with you and George and Chris and Alexei. I think in Africa there are many sort of countries that have been trying to use diversification as part of their development strategy to improve the well-being of their population, to reduce poverty on one hand, but also to create jobs. And I think this is sort of backed by the evidence in the literature that there is a strong correlation between diversification and growth. And of course, when you have growth, most likely you could also have opportunities for poverty reduction and for job creation. The way it works, of course, according to the evidence that we have seen and that has been compiled by Chris and his colleague, but also overall throughout the literature, is that diversification provides opportunities for new industries to grow. And of course, as you do so, you create new opportunities for job creation and for income generation, which of course can help reduce poverty in one hand and create jobs. And I think this is something that is very much also shown to be the case in Africa, where the evidence show that countries that have more diversified economies have tended to sort of grow faster than other countries that do not, particularly countries that are more reliant on a few commodities. And I think this is something that we have seen in many ways. So I do remember actually when I was on the board of the IMF also, there was some other IMF work that was specifically trying to compare the growth performance among diversified economies in Africa and non-diversified economy. And of course, that was the same sort of result that came out of it, showing that those diversified economies tended to grow faster. And I believe also the latest IMF Rio also had something similar in terms of result, showing all of that show that, of course, the diversification of economies and exports have a tendency to help reduce poverty. So, but you have to put some caveat there, because I think the way diversification can really help improve the living standards of population is when it sort of facilitates the creation of new industries that are most likely labor intensive on one hand. That's how it can, of course, create new jobs. Or on the other hand, also, it is important to point out that diversification is not always associated with a reduction of poverty if the growth that is generated is not inclusive in some way. So I think this is critical. So let me give you an example. I think if you do have the emergence of new industries that are more capital intensive, chances are their impact on job creation might not be as significant as you would expect. And I think this is something that needs to be talked about. Of course, I can talk about more the specific case of Senegal and others as we move into this discussion over the next 1 hour.
Well, I want to pick up on the point that you're mentioning about, in particular, the idea that not all expansion is going to be the same, not all diversification is going to have the same and equal benefits across the board. And Chris, I guess with Southeast Asia in particular, and really drawing on the conversations I had in the past week with Philippines and Malaysia, not to mention Vietnam, there's this feeling that, yes, we've moved beyond just agriculture. Take Malaysia as an example, big exporter of semiconductors. But a lot of people think of them as a cheaper version of Singapore, and they don't want that. They want to be considered just as highly paid as anyone else, and not just the discounters. How can you talk about what that evolution looks like, particularly with Southeast Asia as an example, especially as they've moved into the sort of higher skilled types of industries and now trying to get paid as such?
Right. No, thanks very much, Lisa. So I wanted to pick up on Alexis and Dauda's discussion on growth and resilience, because what we find in our work, whether it's cross-country or the latest where we deep dive to particular cases, including in some of them in Asia, is that diversification, first of all, is inducing resilience in these countries. In other words, like Alexei mentioned, when you have a diversified economy and you face shocks, basically these shocks are not as pronounced because the economy is able to absorb them more evenly. Now, in terms of growth, we have done a lot of work, and as Dauda was saying, There is a lot of debate of how exactly diversification, what are the channels actually by which diversification impacts growth. And there are several. One is definitely resilience. We know that more resilient economies, especially those in Africa, are benefiting from higher growth. But also diversification helps in this process of structural transformation. In other words, taking resources from unproductive or less productive sectors, such as agriculture, and placing them, transitioning them to more productive sectors. And of course, that is a very good example that you are bringing up, Lisa, Asia, where they made that transformation, many of these economies made that transformation from agricultural economies to manufacturing economies and beyond. And so the question now is, how do you get this done, right? A lot of countries aspire to diversify. And what we find out from our work is that diversification is an evolution that requires a commitment by the authorities, and it has to be a long-standing commitment that requires also a bunch of reforms. So, and it depends on where you are in that evolution of diversification as a country. Early on, low-income countries, many of them agricultural, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa, they have to depend on these first generation macro horizontal policies. They have to have infrastructure. They have to have, deep institutions. They have to have the support of the government on governance. So this is first order. Unless those are in place, diversification would be very difficult to pick up. Now, as you evolve and as you become more advanced, like the economies you speak about, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, then you have to start thinking about education, your skill level that will adapt to this climbing up the ladder. In other words, you are at a point where you exploited all that diversification could give you at the horizontal level, at having more exports. Now you have to start exploiting how high you will go up the ladder, up the quality ladder. And here we have many examples, again, the India example with IT, where they, in many ways, took advantage of the high educational level, high skill level, and they climbed very quickly on that. So what we have to be thinking is reforms and continuous reforms to help out the diversification process depending on the level of development you have. And just to finish my thought on that, Lisa, in our work we found out that the best help diversification can provide to these countries, especially on the growth side, is when they try to turn the corner from low income to middle income. That's the most critical juncture where you need momentum in terms of growth. You need to be buffered by all of these new shocks as you become an emerging market. And diversification, we found that's exactly when it helps most. From the Asian experiences, we know that those countries have been successful exactly at this critical juncture, where some other countries are still challenged.
Well, I guess that, Alexei, from your perspective in Georgia, what were some of those reforms, some of those broad-based measures that enabled the diversification?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So first of all, as I mentioned, Georgia's reforms are more famous with this horizontal diversification mode, which means like the main focus was related to the structural, institutional, and liberal economic reform. So the most important part, just to look at Georgia's background and the history, country inherited centralized economy. That was the most important element was that it was heavy regulated economy. That was heavily bureaucratized economy with a large size of the government. And the most important part of it was how we should deal with this process so that we debureaucratize it, demonopolize it, and also creating the business-friendly environment so that all these targets that are in the economy, especially for taxation, for fiscal, for all public administration has been achieved. So from that perspective, Georgia's the most important element for what we see so far is that these so-called fiscal reforms related to tax and customs policy and administration, also including free trade and trade policy in general, that played a significant and I believe crucial role in success of Georgia's economic reforms. The second is a public administration reform in general, like public institutions and public services that Georgia has been improved dramatically. And the last one, which I believe the also very important element, is anti-corruption, because this heavily corrupted environment, which was also inherited from Soviet times, and then it was in 2002. If you look at World Bank data, and there are a lot of other evidences, but specifically for World Bank data, indicating corruption perception index. In 2002, Georgia was number one, like champion country in corruption in 2002, while in 2008 that was already the least corrupted country in the region. Like when we are talking about region, this is like Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Caucasus, and Middle East countries. So that particular approach gave us the opportunity to talk about diversification, horizontal diversification of the economy that allowed us to be quite active in foreign direct investments as well as in GDP growth rate. And then we can talk about some specific areas or specific sectors that also been emerged out of this, transport and logistics, some services, as I mentioned, which was not initially like considered to be driving area or driving sector for the economy of Georgia, but then eventually that we see that there are some new sectors that are becoming more and more active in the economy of Georgia.
I'm going to get to Dauda in just a second, but I do want to just follow up, Alexei, because there's a real question inherent in some of your comments, which is how applicable is the experience of Georgia to other developing economies, considering that it was under a different rule. It was very centralized. There were some pretty big governmental shifts that went into laying the groundwork for what you just said.
I can tell you right away that this is quite successfully applicable, first of all, because what we have seen, and that's what my company now, Policy and Management Consulting Group, is doing, working in many different countries, in almost all continents of the world, like, specifically providing this policy advisory and institutional development reform guidance and the technical services and technical advisory services. And what we see is that in many different countries, although they were not part of either Soviet Union or any other large regional unification, so-called. But there are a lot of similar problems related to that. Like just recently, I visited literally 2 days ago. I returned from Pakistan, where, like, for example, tax to GDP ratio is too low, and they have significant problems in fiscal side, and they are just thinking how they can improve this particular one, like how they can improve taxation, tax environment, so that that address the two main areas: how to improve tax to GDP ratio on one hand, and also how they keep a good business enabling environment on the other side. So again, those particular issues related to business enabling environment, horizontal diversification, trade policy and trade development is definitely very important for all countries in many different regions. Like, it doesn't matter whether this is Africa, Southeast Asia, Middle East, or Latin America.
Well, and so I guess to that point, Dauda, I'd love your experience with Senegal. You were mentioning that earlier, and how Senegal really was pretty successful at having this diversification with pairing government as well as private sector players. Can you give us an example of how that could serve as a model for other economies as well?
Well, thank you, Lisa. And just to your last follow-up question to Alexei, I believe what is happening is most of the time the horizontal policies and reform that are being implemented by countries, whether it's in Georgia or elsewhere, actually can be applicable to other countries. You just need to make sure that it is aligned with the country-specific circumstances. So talking about the case of Senegal, as you ask, I think Senegal is known as being a country that has a relatively diversified economies in many ways. It is primarily driven by the services sector, which account for more than 50% of the global the GDP. And at the same time, it also has a vibrant primary sector, particularly the agricultural sector, and a manufacturing industry. And I think the reason why Senegal is relatively diversified, its economy is relatively diversified, actually has some historical sort of explanation. I think right after independence, there was a deliberate policy by governments to invest a lot in local industries. This is how, for instance, a new sort of set of industries emerge, including food industries, whether it is sugar also, and flour, and also oil. There was also industries on phosphate and fertilizers, and also cement industry. All of those actually emerged originally with the push from government, and that has really very much continued until recently. In the past 2 decades, of course, there has also been a very important push from the government to invest more in infrastructure. And I think as a lot of studies are showing, this has quite a big impact on the ability of a country to diversify its economies. And this is how, for instance, Senegal since 2008 has been very much investing a lot in transportation infrastructure, whether it's road, Senegal being one of the first countries in sub-Saharan Africa, outside South Africa, that actually set up some toll roads that had a very transformative impact on the economy. Senegal also very much invested a lot in other type of transportation, more recently on electric buses and also on rapid trains. And these are some type of horizontal policies that very much facilitated the diversification of the economy. Other thing that Senegal did, and of course the government of course has to be credited for that, is to do just like Alexei was talking about, having these horizontal policies whereby they push for reform to facilitate actually investment in infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, and also in the transport sector. So let me tell you about, for instance, in the energy, I think what has happened is after a lot of years of issues with the power company, the government came up with some major reform of the legal framework, allowing for independent power producer to step in and to be able to generate power that is, of course, sold to the national power company, and I think that has been a major success. We have seen over the last several years that Senegal was able to more than triple its power generation capacity. That was important. I think other sort of policies that also Senegal did was vertical policies, as it is called. It is this push to make sure, for instance, that sectors like tourism very much flourish, and that has been quite also important, and unfortunately, of course, with COVID, there has been a step back a little bit, but that was something that was important to note. One last thing that I would also sort of point out in the case of Senegal is it has been able also to do that by making sure that it has very much a partnership with the private sector. For instance, making sure that the private sector is very much involved in energy infrastructure investment. That was very much successful, as I indicated earlier, with the independent power producer, but also by making sure that there is a dialogue among the public and private sector that was quite fruitful and very much helpful in guiding the policymaker in really singling out and selecting the right reforms. We have seen that thanks to that dialogue that was sort of guided at the highest level by the head of state through the Presidential Investment Council, what we have seen is thanks to that dialogue, there has been a lot of reform that were done, encompassing not only the energy sector, but also the land set of reform, also the labor market. There has been some labor market sort of regulation and changes that very much also were very much helpful in introducing more flexibility in the labor market, although there is a lot of scope for moving further on that. So all of those type of horizontal policies were very much helpful in guiding the process for diversification of Senegalese economy. Of course, there is a lot that needs to be done, because I think this is still work in progress, but I think this offers scope for other countries in a comparable situation to learn from that experience. Of course, it came with a number of issues, of course, because whenever you talked about public infrastructure investment, you're also talking about potential impact on the debt situation, which, of course, if you don't manage it well, can return to haunt you. That's certainly once. But also, I think there are also other issues that needs to be sort of very much managed when you use this type of horizontal policies to diversify your economy. And another issue is Senegal has very much also accounted for or sort of rely on the introduction of special economic zones to very much boost exports and production. And what has also happened is when you do so, there is also a risk that you might sort of undermine the integrity of your revenue sort of system, your tax system, which is very much also a danger that needs to be sort of addressed to make sure that the impact of those diversification policies do not necessarily undermine macroeconomic stability.
To Dauda's point, Alexei, what were some of the infrastructure developments in Georgia that you can point to that really were instrumental in the diversification?
Yes, I believe that infrastructure also plays significant role in this, and for Georgia, that was also the important case. Right after so before those structural reforms that we started in 2004, the tax to GDP ratio was so low that government could not spend for infrastructure quite actively. That was around 0.5%, not more than that. And then main driving force for infrastructure investment was the private sector, and in that particular case, large multilateral companies investing in oil pipelines connecting Central Asia, carbon resources to the rest of the world. So that was Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan was one of the projects in this regard, and that was only this one. But right after the solution of this problem of fiscal and especially tax to GDP ratio that has been increased in 2-3 years, quite dramatically. In 2007, we have started investing in infrastructure right away, and that somewhere stand at 8 to 10% of GDP, which was important achievement in that case. And what we also noticed is that that has to be kept on that level as much as possible. So what matters in infrastructure financing is this consistency and stability. So consistency and stability without this so-called fiscal discipline that always there is some kind of temptation to move towards absolutely large inefficiency. And we have seen that even IMF made some reports about that in many countries, investing in infrastructure sometimes inefficient, and we need to be careful what we are doing in that particular case. And in Georgia, that was also the case, because our main point was that, first of all, to invest in the areas like energy sector, which was the main driving force. Of course, in many other countries, this is exactly the same case. Energy is the most important part. Roads and transport and logistics is also another very important area for investments. Then, of course, urban services, water supply, sanitation is very important part for further development of the economy. So this so-called consistency, fiscal discipline, and the proper approach towards that is exactly what matters. And we believe that this is very important for other countries as well, not only for Georgia but also for other countries.
There's a lot to unpack there. And Chris, I'd love you to weigh in specifically on how infrastructure takes on different meanings as you layer on more progress, and frankly, as you layer on more technology. It's one thing for there to be bridges and roads and tunnels and for there to be power plants, but there's another question around, say, internet access and connectivity. And I'm wondering, when you start to look at, say, Southeast Asia or some other economies that are trying to progress beyond the first stages, how infrastructure needs kind of change in terms of their evolution.
Thank you, Lisa. So just to build on what Alexi was saying, basically, there are various layers of difficulties and challenges that countries face in their goodwill to make diversification part of their growth strategy. And again, I'm going back to my original argument that you have to be thinking about diversification as a process, and you have to be able to identify where your country is on that process. Early on in the diversification process for a low-income country, infrastructure is absolutely necessary. Without infrastructure, it's very difficult to think of going ahead with any sort of export-led growth model, which is what has been adopted in Asian economies, basically going beyond your domestic markets, going abroad, tapping into the global markets and trying to meet the global demand. So absolutely you need infrastructure, but as you evolve in this process, as you develop, as you become a middle income economy, you start thinking about what else needs to be in place. And definitely issues of governance, I think in the case of Georgia, are paramount. But beyond, you start thinking about labor markets, how flexible they are. You start thinking about education and the level of skill in the economy that can support this vertical attempt to climb the quality ladder. And then as you move beyond manufacturing to service sectors, how do you adapt to this new reality? We have a long discussion in this literature whether we can actually jump from agriculture to services. Like I think an example is India, a point in case, which they have done very well, but can this be sustainable without having manufacturing? On the other hand, can you stick with manufacturing and not go to services? Almost impossible to do. But here, Lisa, I wanted to bring a couple of specific groups where they face very specific challenges. So one are commodity exporters. And that group really faces particular challenges on diversification. They have one comparative advantage, and that's to export commodities. So how do you go about from that one sector basically being the lifeline for the whole economy for years to diversify to new sectors? We have some very good examples where there was progress, but it's particularly challenging. Here I want to go to a very recent example in Africa where you have these critical minerals, where basically 30% of that is found in Africa. Those minerals can service very well the new technologies. And so how do you get that industry develop and stay in Africa and not just be an extractive industry of the past? I think there is a lot of thinking about how you diversify within that industry. And then it gets us closer to thinking, okay, what is the role then of vertical policies? You do all you can on the horizontal policies, and then countries start thinking about these vertical policies, what we call now the new industrial policies. And there, and I think maybe we'll discuss this in a minute, there is the big question of how careful you need to be in trying to implement some of these industrial policies. So the commodity exporters have to face this issue because they live off commodities, and the question is, how do you immediately diversify to new industries without threatening, of course, the entire economy? The other group I wanted to bring up is small states. Small states, many islands in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, in Africa, they are facing a very big problem, that of size, right? They are very small. So diversification from their perspective is particularly challenging because the cost of it is very high given their small numbers.
It's interesting because implicit in your comments as well as Alexi's comments really go to how you transform a workforce through education and through some of these other measures to change the workforce, right? And there's, of course, the question of commodity producing nations. And Dawda, I'd love your perspective of Senegal and how important education was and sort of, you know, how you get that into place, where you gear the education to in order to really prepare a workforce.
Well, I mean, in the case of Senegal, certainly education has been a key priority for all governments since independence, and I think it's actually one of those rare countries where education account for more than 5% of GDP, which actually tells a lot about really the priority focus that government put to education. Although, of course, you can always talk about how sort of targeted and effective that spending is. So what we have seen is various administrations have very much focus on making sure that they build human capital through education, but they also have very much noticed that there was a great mismatch between the skills that are available in the labor market versus those that are very much demanded or needed by the labor market. And I think this is why the Senegal has very much tried to come up with very sort of specific policies, skills development policies targeted at those unemployed young people and women who are not very much getting a job. You must note that, for instance, Senegal is, of course, has a very high level of unemployment rate. It is estimated in some case to exceed 16%, with, of course, women unfortunately being the most affected one, and also urban areas also having more unemployed people compared to a rural area. But what we have seen, unfortunately, is that the skills development policies have not always been very much effective in some ways. Why? Because, first of all, young people or all the population that receive vocational and technical training is less than 5% of all students. That's the estimate that we have seen on Senegal, which means that, of course, although the government has been putting very much a lot of attention to the needs to improve and enhance skills among in the workforce, they have not been always able to broaden the vocational and training centers the way that it would cover actually more and more sort of people. That's one. And second, I think Senegal has very much made a lot of progress and stride toward diversifying its economy, but I guess it's not clear whether there is evidence that the skills development policies that were implemented by the government have contributed to that. First of all, as I said, of course, the scope for those policies is still quite limited compared to the need and the situation in the labor market. But second, also what we have seen is, I guess, even among unemployed people, the proportion of those who have very much benefited from vocational and technical training is very, very, very small. More than 80% of those unemployed are actually estimated to not have any vocational or technical training, which of course reinforces the fact that the policies have not always been able to very much benefit that segment of the workforce until now. So I think this is something that is a big issue for Senegal and for many other developing countries. And yes, as Chris was saying earlier, I think as you go down to the process and you want to accelerate the diversification process, you certainly need to have a more targeted and more effective skill development policy. And I think there is a lot of scope for learning from the experience of other countries that I think IMF staff in their recent paper have been talking about, whether we are talking about India or other countries in East Asia. I think that's certainly something that offers a lot of scope for potential sort of learning.
Well, to that point, Alexi, Georgia, what were some of the challenges and some of the effective skills-based programs that seem to really be the most effective?
Thank you, Lisa. So I think education sector, as well as like all more like complex approach towards the changes in this field is the most difficult one, not only for Georgia but all the countries I've seen during this process. And I think that Georgia have tried and achieved a lot still, but still there is a huge way ahead because what we have seen so far is that looking at, I mean, if we just look at the whole educational sector, there is a elementary school system, and then there is a professional vocational education, there is higher education, and in all aspects, in all areas, what the changes or scale up of these changes are quite difficult, because that's not only depend on one particular decision. There is also the matter of generation changes as well. Like, if you, for example, do some reforms at the elementary school system and increasing the salary of teachers, doesn't mean that then you will achieve better services in education. Or if you just renovate all schools, physical infrastructure, and improve the physical infrastructure, doesn't mean that you will improve the service at the same time. But of course, all these elements are very important and necessary to really achieve something in education if you want to achieve there, right? So, and then the most important element is the management of school system itself, the management of the schools, and further engagement of all stakeholders in this process, and so on and so forth. Looking at vocational education in Georgia, we also faced a lot of difficulties because this mismatch and skills gap, as we call it in many cases, because what industries being developed before during Soviet times, what we have inherited out of this, and then what industries are now, they are absolutely different. And the education system was not catching up on the same pace, on the same mold. And therefore, we have now a huge part of so-called structural unemployment, when the people who gained their education, but this is absolutely worthless now, they are trying to find their jobs either outside of Georgia or trying to adjust their knowledge to the current realities of Georgian economy. So this process, I believe, this process will still continue. We need to catch up. Definitely, government has to invest in this process as much as possible. The most important one is that we need to integrate further our economy into the rest of the world, and then try to also adjust our educational systems towards the current and new realities that we see in the global economy.
So lay on top of all of this complexity of how to get the right infrastructure, how to get the right education, how you get some of the right policies that are more pro-growth and maybe pro-business, is this question of a changing trade regime. We're talking more about deglobalization, nearshoring, reshoring, a question about whether you're going to see a fissure between countries that do business with China versus the U.S. And Chris, from your vantage point, how does this create challenges, but also opportunities for a number of countries that are trying to diversify at a time where trade traditionally has been one of the key ways to do so?
Yes, Lisa, so you are exactly right. So these are all challenges on top of a challenging environment and a complex process. But I'd like to bring up the issue of industrial policy, because we are talking extensively about this new world of industrial policy. And indeed, I think we have something new in it, because the motives for targeted policies are basically this existential issue of climate change. So many countries are looking for ways of bringing in targeted policies to enhance their abilities to handle climate. There is also a strategic element that you hint on, Lisa, on these policies. The world has changed quite a bit. We are living in a world that is more fragmented. But it's also new because we see these policies, these targeted policies, coming primarily from advanced economies, not necessarily the low-income countries that was the world of the past. Of course, developing economies are thinking of industrial policies as growth strategies, but mainly now industrial policy is implemented, is looked at more carefully by advanced economies. So, of course, this is new, but there are the old concerns, the old concerns about industrial policy, which is you have to make sure that you get it right, because if you don't get it right, the cost to the economy is huge. And by getting it right, our work shows that it should be around big sectors rather than focusing on specific firms, specific, one or two firms. So it has to target big sectors, maybe through special economic zones, maybe through what Dauda was talking about, the public-private partnerships. But those areas where these policies can fill gaps, can fill inefficiencies. Now, as we go to this new world, Lisa, we face these strategic decisions, fragmentation. And so I'll come to the third dimension of diversification we talked about, which is the network that many of these economies, especially the developing ones, have developed through years, right? So in the past, the whole global economy was part of the network. Now, with fragmentation, the choices become much more difficult. Which is your network? Who do you trade with, right? And I think this is going to play up, make diversification, I think, more strategic. It will push countries, especially those that are thinking about their next step in terms of growth and development, to pick and choose. And that cannot be a very favorable outcome, because usually when you pick and choose, even through a very careful attention to what happens to the economy, you end up with inefficiencies. Now, on the nearshoring, we see a lot of interest in countries that are close to big nodes of production. So there is the argument that countries that are closer to Asia, to China, develop this network that is very productive and they benefit a lot from. So it is a challenge for countries in Africa of how to close that gap. And there are a couple of, I think, more optimistic views. One is south-to-south trade, and maybe Dauda can talk to us more about this. We see a great opening for these economies to mobilize this trade with other countries that are developing or emerging. That trade need not be only with advanced economies. And then the second point is AI. There's a lot of criticism about AI stealing jobs, especially low-skilled jobs, but it can also be an opportunity to bridge that gap and, make the network, even though physically it's not possible, but virtually you could be bringing this network closer together.
Well, to that point, Dauda, I'd love your sense of areas that you see as appealing to target, whether it's regions and trade partners for different African nations, or whether it's particular sectors that are good areas to potentially expand in.
Yeah, I think if you look at what has been happening in Africa over the past several years, you've seen that there has been a tendency from African countries to diversify their partners, their trading partners. I think that has been a real sort of a trend that we've seen over the past several years. And that's certainly something that may very much support their efforts to not only diversify, but also to boost growth and reduce poverty. That's one. And I think at the same time also, there has been also internally within Africa efforts to develop regional trade. I think you may all have heard about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which actually sort of is one of the largest free trade areas around the world in terms of the size and the number of countries and also the population cover. We're talking about 54 countries getting together actually to create that, and implementation under the African CFTA has started since 2021. Of course, it's a process that is ongoing, and I think when it is fully implemented, I think there is a lot of estimate that show that it will sizably sort of impact on not only regional trade, but the ability also for countries to succeed their diversification strategy. Because here we are with the continental sort of initiative trying to dismantle all the non-barrier non-tariff barriers within the continent, allowing, I guess, products to ship all the way from South Africa all the way to Algeria in the north. When you talk about Africa, you're talking about countries that are trading among else or potentially trading almost 5,000 products. So once you have that opportunity to really improve trade integration within the continent, I think the payoff are very much sizable and potentially very much important. And one last thing that I would add to that is with regard to the fact that we are heading into a more fragmented world right now. I think there is a lot of concerns, of course, that is rightfully so associated with that. But the silver lining is, as far as a country is interested in diversifying in its economy, the fragmentation also offers a new sort of opportunities. And I think this is what many African countries have understood. This is the reason why some of them are trying to implement those horizontal and vertical policies so that they can also sort of try to get to new markets that have been sort of off target until now. I think this is a silver lining for this unfortunate development, but I think this is also, as you indicated, providing a lot of opportunities for so many countries.
Alexia, I'd love to give you the final word in terms of how to sort of look at the fragmented world and figure out whether it's just targeting certain different trade partners, whether it's in Eastern Europe or other regions, or if it's particular industries that might prove to be more beneficial to really beef up.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think our 1 hour conversation was quite interesting and helpful to understand and realize some ongoing developments in the world and developing specific developing countries. So let me first of all start with a really very interesting statement that Chris made, and I fully agree with that. And I'd like to just develop that further, because for many countries, including Georgia, the most important challenge for the economic growth and development is the scale itself. Like small scale countries, they are facing more difficulties in development, attracting investments and developing some specific sectors or industries, and that's definitely very difficult unless they address this so-called horizontal diversification, when there is a specific approach towards structural, public administrative and other institutional reforms, and also dealing with proper trade policies. In many cases, this is specifically related to free trade agreements or their engagement or integration into the world economy and value chains. So from that perspective, for Georgia's development, that's definitely very important for us to continue that trend. As I mentioned, like we started free trade approach, free trade policies, signing free trade agreements with our main partners, and that's all our neighboring countries plus European Union and China, and we continue that trend. That I believe this is very important. And on the other side, the most important part for Georgia, and that's not only like a political taste for us, this is important direction for us entering into European Union, because that's what matters for Georgia as a small country from economic policy the development as well. Let me also touch a little bit about this horizontal and vertical diversification, because what I believe is that horizontal diversification is the main ground for further development. Then when we are talking about vertical diversification, in many cases we see that sometimes that might contradict each other, because for vertical diversification, if country is not careful in that selection of any industries or giving some particular preferences to some specific players there, sometimes they are creating some protective measures, and then these protective measures are becoming obstacles for further development of the economy, because we see that that creates some monopolies or oligarchic approaches in that or in those particular sectors and industries that were somehow selected as a good industries or vertical diversification points. And the last one, which I also wanted to share with you and the audience, is this: the lessons learned that we got from Georgia's case. Whatever policies we provide, whether this is related to horizontal diversification, vertical diversification, public administrative reforms, or economic liberal reforms, then the most important still remains this rule of law, judiciary, and the democratization of the processes, because if this overall political stability is not allowing further development of the country, then any policy in economic side is absolutely worthless. And we need to consider that when we are talking about overall countrywide reforms and development. So from that perspective, I think that we need to consider those particular elements as well. Thank you, and thank you for
I
inviting
just
me
want to
again.
thank I just want to thank you all. That was really illuminating on multiple levels. Alexei, Chris, Dauda, all of you, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for participating in this.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, John.